after Pearl Harbor, everything changed, and it never went back. Everything was changed for good because immediately, actually, we already knew that we were getting the Kansas ordnance plant. They had already started making plans for it before Pearl Harbor, but we had no idea how it was going to affect our lives. They had said that there wouldn't be enough housing. We knew that, but nobody, people just out in the public didn't pay any attention to it. But bang, hundreds of men came to town. They had discouraged families coming because they knew there wasn't housing, and they wanted the men were, this bunch of men were there just to get the plant built. They had to have 3 lines, and first they started on the administration building. I remember my dad would come home from working. I failed to say my dad was a diesel electrician for the Katy Railroad. And after he had worked 8 hours up there at the Katy, the roundhouse, he'd come home, wash up, and then go out to the plant by 6 o'clock and work until midnight wiring the buildings that they were building. And everybody was a diesel electrician at the roundhouse for the Katy Railroad. And so he would go out about 6 o'clock every night. He'd eat some dinner and then go back out to the plant and work until midnight, and then next day the same thing over, and he didn't even get Sundays off every other week. So it was, and it wasn't just him, it was everybody. And somehow he managed, when they needed so much housing, he managed to decide to turn my bedroom in a sleeping room and put me out in the screened-in porch, which he walled in so that I had a room without screen. And so I spent the war sleeping on the sleeping porch, which was fine. Didn't bother me a bit. Let's see, where was I? All the men were coming to town, and everybody was all crowded up. The highway going out towards the plant, which was a few miles out east of town, that all sprung into bars and nightclubs. And along the way in there somewhere, after when the men left and the families were coming, all of a sudden overnight, if you know where Eastboro is, it's a nice housing area out east of town, hundreds of Army trailers appeared there for families to live in. I went to school with some of the kids that lived out there, and a few funny things happened along the way because there was lots of drinking going on at night, maybe all day too, I don't know. But sometimes they got confused when they came back to their trailers, and they got into the wrong trailers, and then there were lots of stories to tell about those. Of course, it was the school kids that came to school and told the stories. They might have exaggerated a little bit, I'm not certain. The Army Air Force built air bases at Independence and at Coffeyville, and they had no place particularly for them to go on weekends. Well, we had what we called an interurban. The interurban was like a streetcar. It was a streetcar. And it was, I think it ran on a wire that attached up like into the telephone pole. That's the way I remember it. But the interurban would pick up, I think it ran 3 times a day it went from Parsons to Cherryvale to Independence to Coffeyville, and then to South Coffeyville, which was in Oklahoma, and then turned around in a little bit and came back. So that gave all the men in the service a chance to come to Parsons to get away from their bases. And another thing that happened was, at that time, England was being bombed by Germany off the face of the earth. They just bombed and bombed and bombed. You know, England's just more or less a big island. And they were trying to train their Air Force but they couldn't do it because the air bases, as soon as they build an air base, the Germans would bomb it. So they sent, I don't know how many, but quite a few men over to Miami, Oklahoma. They built an RAF air base over there, Royal American Air Force. No, that was just Royal Air Force, that's what it was. And then those boys, I don't know how they came up. Somebody brought them up. They came up from Parsons. There was one that stayed in the home of a friend of mine, and they had English backgrounds. Their name was Mitchell. Gene Mitchell and Ian Mitchell were the kids. And they got me fixed up to have a date with one of the English pilots. And he was a very nice man, but he was too old for me, and I knew it. But I went to movies in the afternoons with him a few times. And when it came time to Penny's to graduate, he asked me if I would come down and pin his wings on him. And that was such a romantic thing. I thought that was a romantic thing to see those women pin the wings on the pilots. But I didn't go because I knew he was leaving right away, and I had a new job I became a telephone operator. When the plant opened so that the women could go to work to load the bombs, they paid so much more than they did at the telephone company, so the telephone operators all quit and went out to the plant. They were used to working night hours anyhow, so it didn't bother them. And they didn't have anybody, so they started hiring high school students. And once I heard that they were hiring seniors, I decided I was going out for one of those jobs. I was just a junior, but they hired me, and then they hired a lot of my friends. So I'm proud to say that juniors and seniors pulled the telephone company through the war years because we did a good job and always showed up for work. As for my pilot friend, he went back to England, and he was only able to make 2 or 3 trips until he was shot down over Germany and killed. So that didn't have a happy ending. Here I go into my tears again. The USO, the first USO was at the Y, and there was a lovely lady here in town named Bea Crawford. Her husband was the banker. She didn't have any children, but she began to hear that the troop trains were coming through town. They were bringing there were so many air bases down in Texas. So they were shipping those pilots out overseas, and they would come, 2 or 3 troop trains would come through Parsons every day. And she thought that they should be served coffee and donuts. So she lined up a bunch of women to serve them. But she began to see that wasn't who they wanted to see. They wanted to see those girls that were working up in the Katy offices, who were all leaning out the windows at the Katy and yelling at them. So she started a club called the GSO, Girls Service Organization. I was too young to get in it. I hated that. But the girls were allowed to come down when a troop train would come through. They came down from their offices and served the coffee and donuts. And then Bea decided we had to have a USO, and I think the city kind of had that in their mind also, because so many guys were coming. They were coming down where I worked. They were coming to the swimming pool. That's where the soldiers were hanging out, and at the Y. And they did have I don't know if I mentioned the Y. Well, that's what I'm talking about right now. The Y had a USO. So they could go to that, but it wasn't very large, but it served the purpose, and the turnout wasn't as large to begin with. But between the city and Bea, they reconstructed 2 buildings downtown, the building south of the Parsonian Hotel became the USO. and it had well, there already had been a dance hall up there, so that worked in well. B was a friend of a boy in my class, and many of you know, Charles Kinsey. He was an interior decorator, and they owned this Kinsey's furniture store here. Well, but we were just 15 at this time, and B knew Charles, so she hired him to be her helper. And she told Charlie that she wanted all the steps up to the second floor painted because they were a mess and hadn't been used in years. So he said, and she said, you get some helpers and I'll pay them all. So he asked me and my friend Laura Ayers to help him paint the stairs. So we picked a green color. Those steps were 12 feet wide, and there must have been 100 of them. And I thought I never want to see another staircase again. We worked on them for 2 days, paint, paint, paint. But when it was all over with, we had a lovely green entrance to a lovely garden at the top of the stairs, and it all worked out fine. The new USO opened, and they had hired a man to run it named, his name was Mr. Bruneller, a father of my lifeguard friend. And they came from Brazil, Indiana. And the USO, they would have big bands at the USO, and a lot of the boys, well, people put them up in their homes like we did. My mother put up 2 sailors from Pittsburgh, and they didn't have any trouble finding a place for them to stay. Let me see here. After the war ended, of course the USO closed, but the YMCA continued, and all these GIs and sailors that came home from the war, they needed some cheap entertainment. I failed to say, I left out my part. I graduated from high school with a class of 46, and I kept up with most of my classmates, and after graduation, I had my first date with a sailor that had just gotten home that week. He had been hanging around the high school trying to line up a date for the graduation prom, and I happened to come down the stairs at about that time, and I had just learned that I thought my date had fallen through. So I told him that he asked me to go, and I said, well, okay, I guess. So I went with him to the first dance, for my first date. And then a year later, same month, I married him. And he was Donna Seeley, and his parents had a Seeley real estate, insurance, and loan business. And that was the way he made his living.